Let's actually get into creating our server that's going to run WordPress. Now, I use DigitalOcean to host, but there are many different hosts out there. In this tutorial, we'll be covering VPS servers, setting up WordPress on VPS servers. While there's a lot of different ways to host WordPress, this tutorial series is going to focus on setting up WordPress on your own managed VPS server. Now, very quickly, there are a couple different methods of hosting. The lowest performance-wise would be shared hosting, that you're looking at something like Bluehost or HostGator, something probably $2 to $5 a month. However, shared hosting doesn't have great performance. The next step up is going to be VPS hosting with pre-built packages. So if you look at DigitalOcean, they do have pre-made packages of WordPress that you can install very quickly and get up and running. However, these pre-built packages for WordPress are not entirely optimized in the way that we want WordPress to be optimized. So for example, looking at the one-click apps, we could install WordPress and have it up and running very quickly by installing WordPress 4.7 on this $10 a month droplet. However, this is not the fashion that we're going to be setting up our server with. We're going to be installing WordPress using a builder program. And I'll show you how to do that in just a second. Now, the first thing we're going to want to do is get our server up and running. So step one of this is to create what is called a droplet. Now, a droplet is, in and of itself, a small computer that DigitalOcean hosts in their data center. And you pay them a monthly fee to power that computer, give that computer internet connection, stuff like that. And in return, what we get is a command line interface to control that computer with and eventually set up WordPress. So the first thing that we need to do to get our server up and running is create a droplet. So let's go ahead and click Create Droplet. So on this screen, we want to select Ubuntu 16.04 x64. This is the best operating system at the time for us to choose. Next, we want to select the size. I'd absolutely recommend starting with the lowest setting here, the $5 a month, because you can always scale up if your website is driving more traffic, but know that you cannot scale down if you start with, like, for example, a $20 a month droplet. You won't be able to scale down to the $5 a month if that website is not receiving as much traffic. So I always like to start with the $5 a month option, and if I need to, I can scale up. Next, we'll select a region. I always use New York 1. The reason I use New York 1 is because New York 1, France 1, and SOFO 1 all have the options to add a volume, which is called block storage. Block storage is just like plugging in an external hard drive to your server. This can be a useful feature in some specific instances of WordPress. However, you probably won't need to add block storage unless you get really in-depth with your WordPress customization. But it's always good to make sure that we have that option available to us. So I always choose New York 1 because it does have that option available. Next, we're going to enable backups. And if you are on DigitalOcean beta program, you can enable monitoring as well. Now, with backups, backups are run every Saturday around 7 p.m. or something like that, but it's run once a week. And what backups are doing, they're creating an image of your server, and it does it automatically, and it does cost 20% of the monthly cost of the droplet. So it's going to be $1 for our $5 per month option here. So it's going to be $6 for our server if we enable backups. And I would recommend enabling backups. I have had to use them in some instances where my WordPress backups failed me in some cases. So it is a good idea to have these backups turned on. It can save you in the long run. Now, before we create our droplet, we want to add an SSH key. Now, SSH is a secure protocol that we use to talk to our servers and to give our server different commands. And SSH is pretty much an industry standard in terms of setting up web servers and talking to web servers. The client that I use to talk to my web servers is called Putty. It's free to download, and it's very easy to use once you get the hang of it. So I'm going to show you now how to set up Putty for DigitalOcean. Okay, so the first step to getting Putty ready to go is to download it. And you can simply go to putty.org and you'll land at this page here. Let's click on Download Putty. And there are two packages that we need to install. Now, I'm on a Windows machine, so this might be a little bit different if you're on Mac or on Linux. But there's basically two programs that we need. One is going to be putty.exe and puttygen.exe, here and here. So let's go ahead and download the 64-bit versions here. And once those are downloaded down here, let's go ahead and open up PuttyGen first. So you're presented with this window, and in this Putty key generator, we're going to be creating our private and public key. Now, the way that this works is our public key is sitting on the server side. Okay, so that the public key is hosted on our server, and the private key is something that you keep on your own computer, usually locked away and in a secure spot on your computer. When you're talking to your server, your public key and your private key are basically handshaking with each other. So this is a much more secure method than entering in a simple password, because nobody's going to be able to get into your server unless they have the password for your private key and the private key file itself. So this is much more secure than just a username and password. So in order to create our public and private keys, let's click on Generate. So it's going to ask us to please generate some randomness by moving the mouse around. And you can see that now we have created our private and public key. You can see here our public key is hashed out in this little window. Next, we want to make sure we enter a key phrase for this, and this will unlock our private key. So I'm entering in a password here. And before we save out our public and private key for using them later, let's go ahead and copy over our public key, and we want to add it to our DigitalOcean account. So let's go ahead and add our SSH key content here. Remember, this is our public key. And let's go ahead and give this a name. And I'm going to add my SSH key. And you can see now that it's using this public key in order to talk to my server. Now, a couple more things that we need to do within PuttyGen. We want to save out our public key. Let's save it to our desktop, and let's call this public key. Let's go ahead and save, and let's do the same for our private key. Let's save this to our desktop and call this private key. Okay, so our key's now saved to our desktop, and this means that we can use these keys in the future if we want to spawn up more servers. Okay, so with our key now generated and everything's looking great for our droplet creation, let's go ahead and give our droplet a name. I'll call this WordPress, and let's create it. Great, so our droplet's been created, and you can see here we have our name, the size of our droplet, the operating system running our droplet, the IP address, and some tags and more information. So the first thing we're going to want to do in order to connect to our droplet is copy our IP address. Now let's go ahead and open up putty.exe, not PuttyGen. We can actually close PuttyGen here. Okay, so with Putty open, you can actually see these are all the instances that I'm currently running. And what you will want to do is a couple of things first. So generally, I like to load in my default settings. So I'm going to click Load. Now, what this is doing is it's clearing out any previous configurations in Putty, and it's asking us to set up a default profile. So there's a couple things that we want to have loaded by default in Putty. We want to have our private key loaded by default so that whenever we create a new instance in Putty, that private key is always loaded, because we'll be using our private and public keys for our own website development. So in order to do this, just follow my lead. Make sure that you click on Default Settings and Load. Now let's click on the SSH tab and the Auth tab and click on Auth. Now we want to navigate to where our key is. In this case, my key is on my desktop. It's called private key, and we're going to open it. You can see now that the private key file for authentication is now pointed to my desktop where my private key is located. You want to make sure that you keep this key in a locked away location on your computer, and you definitely want to have a backup in probably an encrypted zip or something like that, stored on some other place. You want to keep this locked up and secure. Okay, so with that set, let's go back up to our session at the top, and let's click back on default settings and click save. Now what this has done is loaded our authentication key here into our default settings. So whenever we create a new instance, it will be using that private key for authentication. So now let's start talking to our server. Let's click on our default settings and click load. Now let's copy and paste in our IP address here, and let's give it a name. Let's just call this WordPress. And now let's click save. So you can see here down at the bottom, this is the server that we've just created, and we're going to open up the command line to talk to that server right now. So with this selected, we can simply double click, and Putty will give us a security alert, and it will ask us if we want to continue caching our key on the server. We do. So let's click yes. Now Putty will ask us to log in to our server. So when DigitalOcean sets up our server, it's going to give us root access, which means that our server is controlled by the root user, and that root user is using our public key in order to create this handshake between us and the server. So let's log in first as our root user, and we want to authenticate with the password we used to create our key. As you can see now, we're into our server, and we've got our command line here, root at WordPress. Now we are able to start configuring our server.